Welcome to our web development class. In this chapter, we will look at some of the reasons why HTML5 is well suited for responsive design. To begin, HTML5 had its beginning back around the year 2007, and the development was started by the Web Hypertext Application Working Group. They actually initiated the development of this language. A few years later, the W3C got on board with it and eventually took over in conjunction with the Web Hypertext Application Working Group. It officially became a standard, I believe it was in the fall of 2014. One thing that we need to look at with respect to the emergence of HTML5 was that it gave us many new structural elements. And these are essentially block level elements. However, if an older browser, such as IE9 and earlier, did not understand that element, it would just ignore it. Therefore, its block level structure was ignored. Consequently, this concept of a polyfill, initially Remy Sharp wrote the first one. Polyfill is essentially a fill-in for support. And these are generally JavaScript files. And what they do is they enable the browser to understand the basic HTML5 elements. So essentially in these JavaScript files, we're using the create element method of the document object, creating these elements, setting CSS properties so that the browser understands that they are block level elements. Alright, so in today's world, we have been using the HTML5 Shimmer shiv. And here you see where we generally enclose it with the conditional comments. And we are using a content delivery network, meaning that file is hosted on the internet. However, there is another tool mentioned in this chapter called Modernizer. And not only does it provide a polyfill, but it would also allow us to test for other browser features and some other features on mobile devices and CSS also. And here again, it's a JavaScript tool, and these would be implemented using JavaScript. So you can find out more about this. Some other tools, the HTML5 boilerplate. Here again, this is a basic code template that also comes with some of the needed files that developers usually use, such as a normalized.css. A style sheet that you'll see out there being used an awful lot. And what this does, it's a little bit more than just a pure reset style sheet that's resetting our defaults to essentially initializing them all to 0. It also normalizes some browser differences, not only on the desktop, but also on some of our handheld devices. And here again, this is a CSS style sheet, and it would be implemented using the link element. Alright, so you should be familiar with our basic HTML5 elements, our doc type, and in the head section, the meta character encoding element, which comes first, and then the title tag. I would like to point out that in the HTML tag, lang equals en, technically that is not part of HTML5, but it is required for accessibility, and it is a good idea to include it. Here again, it's talking to the screen readers. Alright, so some things that have changed in HTML5 from our former XHTML language. For example, in the link element, type equals text/CSS. That is no longer required. So we don't have to include that. Here again, it's not wrong, but it's just less typing and less for the browser to read. Remember, every little bit adds file size, and on a handheld device, file size is of importance. Alright, the /, here again in XHTML, one-sided elements, also sometimes referred to as void elements, VOID, were self-terminated with the /. Here again, that is no longer required, although you may see it out there. Quotations. We are no longer required to have quotations. However, you can, and single quotes are also allowed. XHTML was a very strict language and everything had to be lowercase. So now technically you can mix your case structure. However, that is not the convention and I don't necessarily advocate it. Another thing that is now allowed in HTML5, which probably would have worked anyway in the past, but it would not have validated, are what are called multi-line links. So here we can enclose block level elements with an inline element such as the A tag, and everything inside would be a clickable block of content. Alright, some things that are obsolete, and there are more. You can see the URL in the text for more information. By default, a hyperlinked image has a blue box around it, and we used to set border equals 0 to remove that. That is no longer allowed, and we do replace that with CSS. However, most browsers are not recognizing that anymore. Some other elements, strike, center, font, frame, and frame set, are obsolete, and there are more. Okay, here we see a traditional div layout. We've been doing this for years, using the value of the ID attribute to uniquely identify that area of content. Now we have new semantic HTML5 elements, which to replace our traditional div layout. Divs are still allowed. However, should there be a better replacement, it is advised to use it. Alright, so we now have a section element, which generally just sections off the document. Nav element used for navigation. Article is used for self-containing content, such as a blog post. So that is something we wouldn't probably be using. Aside is related content. H group was used initially for grouping headings. It was deprecated several years ago. Header, for introduction to a content. Here again, it can be inside any area of content, so you can have multiple headers on one page. The same thing for footer. It's information about the content, and you can have multiple footers on the same page. And the address, it isn't necessarily for a physical address, but it has its meaning is for some kind of contact information. All right, a nice tool, the HTML5 outliner tool. And this is an online tool that allows you to see the outline or structure of your document. So for example, a very minimal example of the code on the right was used in this tool. This is how it would render on the bottom. It shows you a outline structure. Okay, we do have some text level semantic elements. Although these go back to HTML1, we're going to look at the difference between a strong and a B. All right, a B is essentially a physical display. It says it's bold. Here again, we can replace this with CSS. Strong is used to indicate importance. So if that is your intention, you should be using the semantic element. However, we can still wrap something with a B in order to identify it as a selector, or to use a class or an ID in order to apply CSS should we wish to do so. And the EM and I situation is essentially the same. EM should be used to indicate emphasis. I can be used also. All right, let's take a look at what are generally referred to as area. The Web Accessibility Initiative Act, which gave us guidelines for making our documents accessible, such as the alt attribute in the image tag, also gives us some rules for accessibility for rich internet applications. So this concept of a rich internet application is usually something outside of text, widgets, or things of that nature. All right, concept of area has been also extended to provide roles for states and properties for sections on the page. These are recognized by assistive technologies for ARIA-capable screen readers and can actually help guide the user throughout the document, such as good semantic HTML can. These screen readers are trained to navigate based on code, such as lists, headings, etc. And now we are giving them additional abilities to navigate the page. All right, so the role would describe the type of widget, and it doesn't have to be necessarily something that's not content. It can be a menu or an image slider. They also can be used to describe the structure of the web page, such as headings or tables. Inform elements, the state of the object, such as checked for a checkbox. And also there are rules for providing keyboard navigation for the web objects, and that is not covered in this chapter. All right, so let's take a look at some of the common landmark roles that are covered in this chapter. And this is basically related to the document structure. Okay, role equals application, and that is not, it's used to specify a region used for a web application. Here again, that would probably be something dynamic. It's not necessarily tied into any specific HTML5 element, and it would probably be used within a div element. Role equals banner. Here again, it would be used to specify a site-wide banner. Here again, if you have a banner on the home page, you probably have it on your other pages also. It probably would be inside the header element. So here we see the example, header role equals banner. Complementary. All right, an area that's complementary to the main section. Here again, that ties in directly to the meaning of the aside element. And so we would see role equals complementary there. Content info. Here again, that's used to provide more information about the content. Here again, that would tie in nicely to the use of the footer element. So here we say footer role equals content info. Role equals main. Used to specify the main content section of the page. We do have a main element. However, you may not use that. You may use a section. Either way, role equals main is for that purpose. And needless to say, navigation, role equals navigation inside the nav element, because that is the purpose of the nav element, and that would indicate here again to the screen reader the purpose of that structural element. All right, let's talk about embedding media in HTML5. In addition to our structural semantic HTML5 elements, HTML5 has brought us a lot of different APIs. And one of the APIs that we'll look at, API meaning standing for Application Programming Interface, which is something built into our browser, is the ability to natively support audio and video. Up until this point, audio and video, more specific video, has always been dependent on a third-party plugin. And over the years, Flash has become the predominant plugin. Now we have native audio and video elements where we can call a supported file format, and the browser will automatically put the player on the page for us. No need to download the plugin or find out anything else about who has the plugin and the latest version of the plugin. Alright, so here's an example here for the source file, and MP4 is pretty much supported by all browsers. You would need to code in a width and a height, always for video. And here again, there are some other attributes, such as if you want controls on, you need to specify. Autoplay, if you wanted it to autoplay, you would need to specify. Any text or content in between the opening and closing video tag would be read by browsers that do not support that tag. Alright, one issue that we do have still in video here is that not all browsers support the same file formats with respect to HTML5 video. So there are several file formats out there. However, if you use these two, you've pretty much covered all bases. So in the previous example, this was just for using one file, one video file. Therefore, everything can be coded inside the opening and closing video tag. It is two-sided. However, should you wish to have alternate file formats, you would use the source element inside the opening and closing video tags. And here we see an example indicating the type of video for the server, so that just make sure the server knows that. Here again, if the browser doesn't support it, we can write something so that the browser will read that. If you look at this video element, here we have a preload equals auto, and we have a loop element. We can make it go around and around, and a poster attribute. The poster attribute is set to the file name of a graphic, and what that is all about, while the video is buffering, so to speak, you can have a graphic sitting there so that there is no delay for the user. They see something automatically while everything is initializing, and then once it starts, it will start. So this is where we are with file support, and as you can see, MP4 is predominantly supported all across the board, and I assume that will be the file of choice. And I'm only covering video. Audio works the same way, and with audio it is MP3. However, there are a couple other file formats that are supported by HTML5 video, and this is it. No other file formats, just these three. However, you might need to use the OGG or the OGV format for some of the earlier Firefox, Safaris, or Operas. And here again, these are the media type formats. Alright, so how do we make our video responsive? Pretty much the same way we made our images responsive. And remember, when you're working with responsive images or videos, you need to remove you cannot code in the width and the height attributes in your HTML code. They are not required in HTML5. They're nice, they help the page load faster. However, if they're there, that will take precedence over any CSS because it's HTML. So you would need to remove them from the video element. You can code them in with CSS should you need to do so for your desktop breakpoint. And once you scale down to the smaller devices, the video would be set to max width of 100% of its enclosing container, and we would set the height to auto, similar to what we do for responsive images. However, a lot of our video that we use comes in from other third-party applications such as YouTube, or there's others. And at this point in time, they are embedded using the iframe element. Now, we can't use CSS to make that responsive, unfortunately. We need a JavaScript plugin. There's a very popular one out there called FitVids, and that would be coded in using a CDN, a content delivery network, and because this is JavaScript, we would be using the opening and closing script tag. You would also need to have a little bit of additional JavaScript to call this plugin in your HTML code. There's more information in the book and in the supplemental resources. Lastly, another API that HTML5 has given to us is what is referred to as offline web applications. And here again, a lot of these APIs have to do with the handheld devices. So when you have a portable device, sometimes the connection might be lost, especially if you're driving in a car and you go through a tunnel or something. What we have is this technology that allows us to code using a text file to indicate what resources should be cached And if the connection is lost, we can use the browser cache to persist that connection, so to speak, with our files. All right, this is called the cache manifest file. You might hear it referred to as the manifest file. It's technically also what is called application cache. All right, so it's all pretty much the same thing. And what that allows us to do is to have this nice large cache in our browser. And this is technically an HTML5 API. This file is a text file with a .manifest extension, and what you would do is list the resources that will be available when offline. You don't necessarily need to list them all, but the important ones. How that is accessed or referred to in the browser is inside your HTML element, as shown here, using the manifest attribute. And there is more information in the book to explain a little bit more about how to use this.